he only wanted peace after the war. Jake Walker, a quiet man with tired eyes, bought an old stone house in the woods, hoping to start over with his loyal dog Max. But what if that house was never meant to be found? What if its walls still held the truth about a man who never really died, and a town built on buried lies? When Jake uncovered the hidden cellar and the old uniform marked with a missing name, everything he believed began to crumble. Why did the townspeople fear the house? Who was watching him at night? And could one man and his dog really bring light back to a place that had forgotten what honesty looked like? This is a story about courage, redemption, and the quiet miracle of finding faith again when the world has gone dark. I hope you enjoy this story of Jake Walker Max and the summer that changed Briar Hollow forever. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The air was mild that morning, heavy with the scent of pine and damp soil. A soft haze floated between the trees, and sunlight filtered through like gold dust falling in slow motion. It was the kind of summer day that looked calm on the surface, but held a quiet tension, like the woods were holding their breath. Jake Walker parked his old blue pickup at the edge of the gravel path and stepped out. He was 47, broad-shouldered, but lean, with lines at the corners of his gray-blue eyes that told stories of deserts and storms. His hair, once a deep chestnut, had faded to a mix of brown and silver. A short beard framed his square jaw, neatly trimmed out of habit, a soldier's kind of order he never lost. The sleeves of his worn flannel shirt were rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms marked with faint scars, each a small memory of his time in service. Jake was not the kind of man who spoke much, but everything about him seemed to say he had already lived 3 lives and was still learning how to live a 4th. Max trotted beside him, his paws crunching softly over gravel. The German Shepherd was 8 years old, his black and tan coat still sleek, though his muzzle had begun to gray. His amber eyes were sharp, intelligent, and always moving, scanning, assessing. There was something military in his posture, too. The way he stood slightly ahead of Jake, ears pricked, as if still expecting an order. Max had once served alongside Jake during deployment, trained to sense danger before men could. Now retired and slower, he had become Jake's only family. The house stood at the end of the clearing, a structure of pale stone half covered by ivy. Its roof sagged slightly, and the porch rail leaned as if tired from holding the years. But there was beauty in its quiet decay. The wide front windows caught the morning light, reflecting the forest like a mirror. To Jake, it was more than a house. It was a promise of peace, or at least a place where the noise in his head might quiet for a while. He pulled the folded deed from his jacket pocket. The paper was thin, almost transparent, printed with the county seal. 50 cents. That was all it had cost him. When the clerk at the courthouse looked at him puzzled and almost sympathetic, Jake had simply said he needed something old enough to stand still when everything else kept moving. He opened the truck's back door and lifted a small wooden box. Inside were his only belongings: a few clothes, a set of tools, a photo of his mother smiling from a garden bench, and a medal he never displayed. He placed the box on the porch, then stood for a moment in silence. The forest buzzed faintly with cicadas, steady and rhythmic like a heartbeat. "Come on, Max," Jake said quietly. His voice was low, steady, the kind of tone that could calm storms. But Max did not move. The dog stood at the base of the porch steps, body rigid, tail lowered but not tucked, his ears angled backward slightly. It was a posture Jake recognized, one he had seen in places where men did not return whole. "What is it?" Jake murmured half to himself. Max's gaze was fixed on the open doorway. The shadows inside were thick, the air beyond them darker than it should have been for a summer morning. Jake frowned, then climbed the steps slowly. The wood creaked beneath his boots. He reached for the doorknob, a cold brass circle worn smooth by years of use. Inside, the air smelled dry and faintly metallic. Dust hung in sunlit beams that spilled through half-open shutters. The floorboards, though old, were solid. Jake ran a hand along the wall, feeling the coolness of the stone beneath faded plaster. Everything looked ordinary enough, except for the silence. Not the kind of silence that brings peace, but the kind that listens back. Jake turned to call Max again. The dog had moved closer, but stopped just short of the threshold. His nose twitched, and he let out a low sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whine. "All right," Jake said, forcing a half smile. "Guess you are not impressed?" He took a few steps inside. Each creak of the floor echoed too long. The living room opened wide, its stone fireplace cool and empty. A single chair sat tilted in a corner, its fabric moth-eaten but still upright. On the mantel, a small glass bottle caught a shard of sunlight. Inside it, a dry sprig of lavender lay curled and brittle. Someone had lived here once with gentleness. Jake stood still for a long moment, hands in his pockets, watching dust swirl in the light. He thought of his mother's garden, of how she used to hum to the flowers when she watered them. He remembered her voice the day before he left for his second tour, soft but steady, saying that quiet places never stay quiet forever. He wanted to believe this place could be different. Outside, Max barked once short and sharp. Jake turned quickly, instinct kicking in, the old reflexes still wired deep. He stepped back onto the porch. The dog was facing the woods now, ears high, body angled like a soldier in formation. Jake scanned the tree line. Nothing moved except the shimmer of heat in the distance. The branches swayed lazily, but something about the air felt heavier now. "Relax, boy," he said softly, though his own voice carried a tremor. "It is just us." Max's eyes stayed fixed ahead for another heartbeat. Then he looked back at Jake, ears folding slightly. He seemed uncertain, but after a moment, he climbed the steps and stopped beside his owner. His paws pressed against the wood nose, dipping low as he sniffed the air again. Jake reached down, running his hand over the rough fur at Max's neck. "We have been through worse," he whispered. "This is supposed to be the easy part." He walked back inside Max, following close this time, his nails clicking softly on the wooden floor. Together, they explored each room: empty kitchen cabinets, a hallway leading to 2 small bedrooms, and a cellar door that groaned when touched but refused to open. When they finished, Jake opened a window and let in the warm breeze. It smelled of pine, old rain, and wildflowers. For the first time that day, he felt something close to calm. He unpacked a few tools, fixed the porch hinge, and hammered a loose board back into place. The rhythm of work soothed him, the kind of steady motion that gave shape to the hours. By evening, the sun lowered behind the ridge, turning the light gold and soft. Jake sat on the steps with a cup of instant coffee. Max lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but still alert. The woods hummed with crickets. "This might work," Jake said, almost to the wind. "You and me. Quiet, simple." But Max lifted his head, staring again toward the open doorway. His ears twitched once, twice. A low sound left his throat, deep and uncertain. Jake followed his gaze. The air inside the house looked still, yet a shadow near the hallway seemed thicker than before, like the light refused to enter. He told himself it was nothing, just his eyes, just fatigue. Still, when he stood to go inside, he noticed Max did not follow. The dog stayed on the porch, staring as if waiting for the house to blink first. Jake sighed. All right, stay if you want. He stepped through the doorway once more, feeling the temperature shift slightly cooler. He told himself it was just the stone walls. But a small, involuntary thought crossed his mind, one that made his chest tighten. Maybe Max knew something he did not. As night settled, the first evening in the stone house ended in uneasy silence. Jake unpacked his cot near the fireplace and lay down, listening to the rhythmic breaths of his dog outside. He closed his eyes, willing himself to rest, but his mind kept returning to that moment when Max had refused to cross the door. Something in that stillness had felt wrong. It was not fear exactly. It was more like the pause before a story begins. And in that pause, the house seemed to wait with him. The next morning began soft and still. The air was warm but not heavy. A mild summer light drifting between the trees and slipping through the cracks of the shutters. Dust moved lazily inside the house, turning gold whenever a breeze came through the window. Birds sang somewhere deep in the woods, their sound distant but steady like a heartbeat that belonged to the forest itself. Jake Walker stood in the middle of the living room with his sleeves rolled up. He had been working since sunrise, cleaning, sweeping, and trying to bring life back to the house. Sweat darkened the edges of his shirt, and his palms were rough with dust and splinters. There was a kind of satisfaction in the rhythm of it, in building something small and quiet after years of noise and orders. Every nail he drove into wood, every board he straightened, felt like reclaiming a little piece of himself. Max followed him from room to room, his movements quiet but alert. The dog had relaxed slightly since the night before, though his ears still twitched at every unfamiliar sound. He sniffed at every doorway, every corner, every bit of furniture. Sometimes he would stop and stand perfectly still, head tilted, as if listening to something Jake could not hear. The house smelled of old paper and stone. Jake worked slowly through each room, his steps echoing softly on the wooden floor. In the kitchen, he found a faded calendar still hanging on the wall, the pages yellowed and curling. The year printed on it was 1982. A woman's handwriting had marked a few dates with neat loops of blue ink names and phone numbers that had long since faded into ghosts. Jake stared at it for a moment, wondering what kind of life had filled this space before it went silent. He moved back into the living room and wiped the sweat from his brow. Max lay stretched on the floor tail, flicking lightly, eyes half closed, but watching. Jake smiled a little. "We will make this work," he said softly, though he had stopped expecting answers. He was just about to hammer down a loose floorboard when a faint sound stopped him. It came from somewhere behind the wall to his left, near the old stone fireplace. At first it was so light he thought it might be a trick of wind or a mouse. But then it came again, slow and deliberate, a faint scratching, like nails dragging softly against wood. Jake froze. His breath caught for a second, and his hand tightened around the hammer. The sound stopped, and for a long moment there was nothing but the distant hum of cicadas outside. He waited listening. Then it came again, a little sharper this time, like something trying to come through. Max lifted his head at once. His ears pointed forward, his body stiffened, and a low sound built in his throat. Jake felt a familiar surge of alertness, the kind that had once kept him alive in places far from home. He lowered the hammer and moved closer to the wall. The scratching stopped again. Jake knelt, placing his ear against the plaster. It felt cool solid, but behind it, there was a faint, hollow echo. He tapped it lightly with his knuckles. The sound came back dull at first, then shifted to a hollow tone near the center. His brow furrowed. The wall was not solid stone all the way through. Max stood now pacing slowly along the edge of the room. His tail was lowered, his nose pressed against the baseboard. He let out a sharp bark and began scratching at a spot just above the floor. Jake crouched beside him, brushing away a thin layer of dust. The plaster there looked different, a little smoother, newer than the rest. Someone had repaired this part of the wall. Jake's heartbeat quickened, not from fear exactly, but from that strange pull of curiosity that comes when silence hides something. He fetched a chisel and began to scrape gently at the spot. The first layer came off easily, flaking into powder. Beneath it was a seam, faint but straight, as if a panel had been sealed into place. Max barked again, shorter this time, circling close, his claws clicking against the floor. Jake worked carefully, prying at the edges. A crack widened. A gust of dry air slipped through, carrying the scent of old wood and something else, something metallic, like rust or dust-covered nails. He eased the chisel deeper until the panel gave way with a soft groan. Behind it, darkness waited. Jake grabbed a flashlight from the table and shone it through the opening. The beam cut through a small space, maybe a few feet wide. Dust floated like ash. At the back of the gap, he could see a narrow handle, a small wooden door, half hidden in the shadow. He exhaled slowly, then looked at Max. The dog's body was tense but forward, not retreating. That was enough. Jake widened the hole and reached in fingers, brushing the old handle. It felt cold and dry. The latch stuck for a moment, then gave. The wooden door opened inward with a creak that echoed deep below. Behind it, a narrow staircase descended into the dark. He hesitated, the beam of his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The steps were stone worn smooth by time, leading into a place that smelled of earth and forgotten years. Max whined softly, standing close to his leg. Jake crouched and rubbed the back of the dog's neck, his hand firm and steady. "Easy," he murmured, though the words were more for himself. They started down together. Each step echoed faintly, swallowed by the space below. The air grew cooler, thicker. When they reached the bottom, the flashlight revealed a small cellar, low-ceilinged and lined with shelves. Cobwebs hung from the beams, and boxes lay stacked along the walls, their surfaces gray with dust. Jake swept the light across the room. At first, it looked like nothing more than a storage space left behind by whoever once lived here. But then on the far side, the beam caught the edge of a metal filing cabinet. Its drawers were closed, but the handle gleamed faintly. He crossed the room, brushing aside a curtain of cobwebs. The cabinet door creaked open, revealing folders yellowed and curled. The first one bore a county seal and the word "Property Records" written in fading ink. He flipped it open. Inside were land deeds, survey notes, maps marked with red lines. He did not recognize any of the names, but the dates were recent compared to the rest of the house's age. As he read, a photograph slipped from between the pages. It was black and white, slightly torn at the corner. It showed 3 men standing in front of what looked like the same stone house decades earlier. One of them was in uniform, his posture rigid, his face half-shadowed. The name scrawled on the back made Jake's stomach tighten: Harold C. Bradley. Jake knew that name. He had seen it printed in an old newspaper at the diner last week, in an article about a county official who vanished 20 years ago. The town had called it an accident, but accidents did not get hidden behind walls. He placed the photo down carefully and looked deeper into the cabinet. Beneath the papers lay a folded military jacket. The fabric was thick wool, still holding its shape despite the dust. He lifted it slowly. The name stitched inside the collar matched the one on the photograph. For a moment, he just stood there, holding the jacket. It felt heavier than it should, as if it carried something more than fabric and thread. Memories, maybe, or guilt left to rot in the dark. Max let out a low growl. Jake turned. The dog was standing at the foot of the stairs, head tilted toward the shadows near the ceiling. Jake followed his gaze, but saw nothing. Only the faint movement of dust where his light had passed. He swallowed hard. "All right," he said softly, steadying his breath. "We have seen enough." They climbed back up the sound of their footsteps, muffled by the thick air. When Jake closed the small wooden door and slid the panel back into place, the scratching sound was gone. Only silence remained, but it was no longer peaceful. It felt like the house had been listening. Jake sat on the floor beside Max, the flashlight dim in his hand. His mind turned in quiet circles. He had come here for rest, for quiet, but now he had opened a door that refused to stay closed. The sun outside had turned gold again, spilling through the window like nothing had changed. But Jake felt it. Something had shifted. The house was no longer empty, and peace was no longer simple. The day broke with a pale sun that hid behind thin clouds. The air felt heavy with the smell of soil and distant rain. A light breeze passed through the trees around the house, carrying the sound of crows from somewhere beyond the hill. It was the kind of morning that looked calm, but carried the weight of something unspoken. Jake Walker stood by the truck, staring at the old papers he had found in the cellar the night before. The name, Harold C. Bradley, was still written clear across the folded documents. He had barely slept. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw that photograph again, the three men standing before the same stone walls that now surrounded him. The silence of the house had turned from quiet to watchful, and every creak in the night had made him open his eyes. He folded the papers carefully and slipped them into a worn leather folder. Max circled nearby, restless. The dog's coat glistened faintly in the morning light, but his tail stayed low and his eyes moved between the trees. He had not barked since last night, but the tension in his body told Jake he was still on edge. Jake ran a hand over his beard and took a slow breath. He decided to drive into town. Someone there had to know about the name in those papers. The road was long and cracked, winding through fields of tall grass. As he drove, the landscape shifted from forest to a scattering of small wooden houses, their paint faded by years of sun. Briar Hollow was not much of a town anymore. A gas station stood at the crossroads beside a diner with a faded sign that read, "Mary's Place." A few shops lined the main street, all old but neat, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's history. Jake parked the truck in front of the diner and stepped out. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and old wood. A ceiling fan turned slowly, stirring the smell of bacon and soap. At the counter stood an older woman, her hair gray and tied back her frame, tall but thin, her hands quick as she wiped down the surface. Her name tag said Mary. Her skin had the bronze tint of someone who had spent a lifetime in sunlight. Her eyes were sharp, but there was warmth buried deep behind them, like a fire that had learned to burn quietly. Jake nodded in greeting and took a seat at the counter. She looked him over, once the way people in small towns do when they are measuring whether you belong. "Morning," she said, with a slow drawl that matched the rhythm of the place. "Coffee." "Please," he answered. She poured it without another word, but her eyes stayed on him curious. "You new around here?" she asked after a moment. "Just moved into a place a few miles out," Jake replied. "The old stone house near the creek." Her hands froze mid-motion. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. The sound of the ceiling fan filled the pause. Then she set the pot down carefully and leaned her weight on the counter. "That house," she said slowly, "that place has been empty a long time." Jake gave a faint smile. "Not anymore." Mary studied him again, then straightened up and looked toward the window as if to avoid his eyes. "Some places do not take kindly to being lived in again," she said softly. He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" She wiped her hands on her apron. "Folks around here call it Bradley's house. Used to belong to a county man. Disappeared one night. After that, his wife left town and no one stayed there long. Strange things happen." Jake hesitated before reaching into his folder. He slid one of the old papers onto the counter, the one with the county seal and Bradley's name written in ink that had browned with time. "Do you remember him?" Harold Bradley Mary's eyes narrowed slightly as she looked at the page, but she did not touch it. Her voice dropped low. "You should not be carrying that name around," she said. "There are some things best left buried." Jake wanted to ask more, but her posture changed. Her shoulders drew back, her gaze distant. The warmth in her tone faded to something closed and guarded. He realized then that the whole diner had gone quiet. Two older men sitting by the window were watching him now, their faces lined with the kind of suspicion that belongs to people who have lived too long in the same place. One wore a cap stained with engine oil. The other had a newspaper folded under his arm. They whispered something to each other, eyes flicking between Jake and the paper. Mary turned away and pretended to refill the coffee pot. Jake understood the signal. Conversation was over. He left money on the counter and stepped outside. The sunlight had dimmed slightly, clouds rolling low over the hills. The whole town seemed to watch him as he walked to his truck. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes through the diner windows, through the small cracks in the blinds of the shop across the street. Max sat waiting in the truck bed, his eyes fixed on the direction Jake had come from. When Jake climbed in, the dog whined softly and pressed his head against his arm. Jake started the engine, but did not drive right away. His hands rested on the steering wheel. He could still hear Mary's voice in his head. Some things best left buried. He thought of the cellar, the photograph, the heavy silence under the floorboards. By the time he reached the house again, the day had turned gray. The woods that had looked calm that morning now seemed denser, the air thicker. He parked the truck and stepped out. The first thing he noticed was the stillness. No birds, no wind, just the faint creak of the porch and the quiet. Inside, everything was as he had left it. Yet he felt the change immediately. The air carried a different weight, as if it had been disturbed. He placed the folder on the table and rubbed his forehead. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe the house was starting to get under his skin. He fixed a small meal, sat down by the window, and watched the light fade. Max lay near the door, head resting on his paws, eyes half open but alert. Jake tried to read one of the old land records, but the words blurred. Every now and then he looked up at the trees outside, waiting for movement. As the evening deepened, he decided to check the perimeter. He took a flashlight and stepped outside. The grass brushed against his boots. The woods were quiet, too quiet. He circled the porch once, then twice. Nothing. He turned toward the back of the house. That was when he saw it. A figure faint and still standing at the edge of the trees. It was not close enough to see clearly, just a darker shape against the dim sky. Jake froze. The light from his flashlight cut through the branches, but when it touched the spot, the figure was gone. Max erupted in a deep bark that echoed through the woods. The sound carried power sharp and alive. Jake spun around, scanning the shadows. The dog stood firm at the porch, Hackle's raised eyes locked on the same place Jake had seen the figure. He moved back toward the door, keeping his eyes on the trees. His breath had gone shallow without him realizing it. He reached the porch and stood beside Max, who was still growling low in his chest. It could have been someone from town, he told himself, a hunter, maybe, or a stranger passing through. But the voice in his head did not believe it. When he finally went back inside, Max stayed at the door for a long time, his body still tense. Jake sat at the table, staring at the dark window. Somewhere in the woods, a branch snapped. Then silence again. He felt a strange certainty take root in his chest. Whatever secret the house had, it was not finished with him. That night, as the lamp burned low, Jake lay awake on the cot near the fireplace. Max stayed by the door, watching. The air in the house felt alive, like it was listening. The scratching from the wall had stopped, but something else had begun. The afternoon sun was soft and muted. The air held a still warmth that clung to the narrow streets of Briar Hollow. The sky hung low and pale, filled with drifting clouds that looked like smoke fading over the hills. Jake Walker parked his truck beside a small cafe near the edge of town. Its wooden sign faded to near white. The place was quiet, except for the faint hum of an old refrigerator and the low tune of a radio playing from inside. He stepped out, folder in hand, the same worn collection of papers he had carried since the day he found them. Max followed close, the German shepherd's dark coat glinting under the weak sun. His steps were measured, his nose twitching at every new scent that drifted through the street. Jake entered the cafe and paused near the doorway. The place smelled of roasted beans and paper. Only one customer sat near the window, a woman typing on a laptop, her fingers moving fast but calm. Her dark hair was tied loosely, strands falling over a tanned face that carried the calm exhaustion of someone who had seen too much and trusted too little. She looked to be in her late 30s, with sharp eyes that seemed to study everything before deciding what to believe. When she looked up and met his gaze, she did not seem surprised. Her tone was even. "You must be Jake Walker." Jake hesitated. "That depends on who is asking." The woman closed her laptop and gestured to the seat across from her. "Emily Carter," she said, "independent journalist. I have been following stories about the county records and the land seizures. You are the first person who has actually found something they could not erase." Jake sat slowly, keeping his folder close. She was confident but not arrogant, her posture relaxed, yet alert, like someone used to being watched. He noticed the faint scar along her right wrist, old but clear, a mark of some past encounter she did not talk about. "What do you know about Harold Bradley?" Jake asked. Emily leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing slightly. "Enough to know People stopped asking the right questions after he vanished. Every trail I followed ended with missing files, quiet retirements, and people pretending they never worked for him. She glanced at the folder in his hand. That looks heavy. Jake gave a faint smile. It is. Found it behind a wall in that old stone house near the creek. At that, Emily's expression shifted. The house in Briar Hollow. You found it there. Jake nodded. She exhaled slowly, her voice lowering. I have read reports about that property. It was listed under the county's control for years, but it never went up for sale. That means someone wanted it, forgotten, not sold. Jake looked down at the table. I am beginning to understand why. For a moment they sat in silence, the kind that fills when two strangers realize their fears overlap. Emily reached for her bag and pulled out a small recorder. Mind if I ask you a few questions off the record for now? Jake shook his head. Not here. Her brow furrowed slightly, but she did not argue. He could tell she was cautious, but her curiosity was stronger than her fear. They decided to leave and talk somewhere quieter. Emily packed her things, and Jake stood scanning the street outside through the window. Everything looked normal, just a parked car across the road. Black-tinted windows, reflecting the dull sky. They walked out, Max trotting a step ahead. The afternoon light had started to fade, painting the streets in shades of amber and gray. Emily unlocked her sedan, but Jake stopped her. Let us take my truck, he said. Something about that car does not sit right. She turned to look. The black car had not moved, but Jake noticed a faint glint on the windshield, the kind that came from someone watching. They got into the truck, and Jake started the engine. As they pulled away, the black car came to life behind them. Emily saw it in the side mirror. That is not a coincidence. Jake's grip tightened on the wheel. No, it is not. They drove through the narrow back roads, the truck's tires crunching over gravel. The car followed at a steady distance, never too close, never far enough to be forgotten. Max shifted in the back seat, his ears twitching, a low rumble building in his chest. Emily kept glancing at the mirror. You think it is someone from the county office? Jake shook his head. If it was official, they would not hide. Whoever it is, they do not want us talking. The car sped up, suddenly closing the distance. Its engine roared through the quiet valley. Jake turned sharply onto an old logging road, the tires slipping in the dust. The car followed, lights flickering through the trees. Hold on, Jake muttered, steering hard into a turn. The truck bounced over uneven ground gravel, spitting from the tires. Then Max barked sharp and loud. The dog stood with his paws braced against the window, teeth bared. The car came closer, and its front bumper brushed the back of the truck. Emily gasped, gripping the dashboard. Jake's pulse pounded. He looked for an escape, but saw only trees and shadow. Then Max lunged his front paws, hitting the truck door. His bark was fierce, echoing through the woods. The black car slowed just for a second, as if the sound had broken something inside the driver's nerve. That hesitation was enough. Jake swerved hard to the right, skidding into a clearing. The car tried to follow, but Max jumped down from the truck bed, landing square in the dirt, standing tall between the car and the trees, growling deep and steady. The car stopped. The driver did not step out. For a long moment, the two stood locked in stillness, man's best friend, against a silent machine. Then the car reversed the tires, spinning dust into the air before it turned sharply and vanished down the road. Jake exhaled, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Emily turned to look at Max, who stood panting but proud, his chest heaving. He saved us, she said softly. Jake stepped out, walking toward the dog. Max looked up at him, tail wagging once, slow and sure. Jake knelt resting, a hand on the dog's back. You did good, partner. Emily walked closer, her expression mixed with awe and fear. Whoever was driving that car, they know we are together now. Jake nodded. Then we stay ahead of them. They stood there in the quiet clearing, the wind carrying the last warmth of the day through the tall grass. Somewhere behind them, the road stretched back toward the town that did not want to remember. Ahead lay the truth that someone was desperate to keep buried. For the first time since he arrived in Briar Hollow, Jake understood the danger was not behind him. It was watching from the shadows, waiting for them to take another step closer to what they were not supposed to find. The evening sky turned a deep gray, heavy with the smell of coming rain. The air was warm but restless, carrying the low roll of thunder from somewhere beyond the hills. The tall pines around the stone house swayed slowly, their branches whispering in the wind. Inside, the lights flickered once, then steadied, casting a faint yellow glow across the worn wooden floor. Jake Walker sat at the kitchen table, sorting through the papers they had found. His hands were calloused, the knuckles scarred from years of labor and war, yet they moved with a soldier's precision. Emily Carter sat across from him, her eyes scanning a document under the weak light of a single lamp. She looked tired, her dark hair pulled into a loose braid that had come undone in strands. There was a quiet determination in her face, the kind that grew from disappointment and persistence in equal measure. Outside, the rain began to fall soft, at first tapping against the roof. Max lay near the door, head on his paws, eyes half closed, but alert. Every now and then, his ears flicked toward the windows as if he was listening for something that neither of them could hear. Jake leaned back in his chair. "We are running out of time," he said quietly. "Whoever was in that car is not going to stop." Emily looked up from the papers. "I know. That is why we need to find out what Bradley was hiding before they do." She turned one of the pages toward him. "Look at this. These signatures, they are duplicates. Land deeds copied and sold to shell names. Someone was erasing ownerships on purpose." Jake rubbed a hand over his face. His mind felt heavy the way it used to, before missions he knew might go wrong. He looked around the room, listening to the rain. This house, he said slowly, was part of all this. Maybe Bradley hid everything here because he knew someone would come for him. Emily's voice softened. Maybe he thought the house would keep his secret safe. A sharp crack of thunder shook the air. The lights blinked once, twice, then went out. The room fell into darkness. Jake stood instantly. "Stay here," he said, reaching for the flashlight on the counter. The beam cut through the black, reflecting faintly on the stone walls. The air felt thicker now, charged with static, and something colder, something unseen. Max rose, tail stiff, ears forward. His body moved before Jake gave any command. The dog padded toward the front door, nose working the air. Jake followed, flashlight steady in his hand. The door was closed, the lock still turned. Yet as the wind howled outside, it gave a faint creak just enough to move. Emily's voice came softly from behind him. "I thought you locked that earlier." "I did." He turned the handle slowly. The metal was cold, slick with moisture. He pushed and the door opened halfway. Rain blew in, spattering the floor. He looked down at the lock again, then at Max. The dog's nose pressed against the floorboards, then lifted toward the stairs leading down to the cellar. A low growl escaped his throat. Jake met Emily's eyes in the flashlight's beam. He has found something. They followed Max down into the basement, their footsteps muffled by the thick air. The cellar smelled of stone earth and rain leaking through old cracks. The single bulb above their heads was dead, leaving the beam of the flashlight their only guide. Max stopped near the back wall, the same one Jake had broken through days ago. He sniffed the ground, then began pawing at the floor. Dust rose with every scrape of his claws. Emily crouched beside him, holding the light. "Look," she whispered. "There is another seam here in the stone." Jake knelt and pressed his palm against the spot. The wall felt uneven, a small crack running along its base. He took a crowbar from the corner, wedged it in, and pried carefully. The stone shifted slightly with a soft groan, then slid aside, revealing a narrow opening that slanted downward. Emily leaned closer. "What is this?" Jake pointed the flashlight into the gap. The light hit damp rock and old wood beams. A narrow passage stretched forward the walls, dark with moisture. The air that flowed out was cool and stale, but not untouched. Someone had been there not long ago. Max stepped forward first, his movements cautious but determined. His tail brushed the walls as he moved, ears tuned to every drip and echo. Jake and Emily followed their shoulders, brushing the narrow stone as they descended. The tunnel sloped slightly downward until it opened into a circular space, half collapsed. Jake raised the light. In the middle of the room sat a rusted metal cover, half buried in mud. Emily knelt beside it, brushing the dirt away. "It is an old well," she said quietly. "Maybe it connects to the creek." Jake ran his fingers along the edge. The cover was heavy, corroded but still movable. Together, they lifted it enough to reveal darkness beneath and the faint sound of dripping water. He looked at Emily. If someone wanted a way out of the house without being seen, this would do it. She nodded. Or a way in. The thought hung between them, like thunder waiting to strike. Max suddenly barked, once sharp and urgent. He backed away from the well-nosed high eyes, fixed toward the tunnel they had come through. Jake killed the flashlight. They stood in pitch black. For a long moment, there was only the sound of rain pounding faintly above. Then came another sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate moving across the floorboards above them. Emily's breath hitched. She whispered, "Someone is in the house." Jake motioned for silence. His heart pounded, but his mind was clear. Years of training came back in an instant. He took Emily's hand and led her toward the tunnel. Max stayed close, silent, now his body low and ready. They climbed up the narrow passage, their breaths shallow. The light from the flashlight stayed off. They could hear it now clearly. A faint thud, the creak of a chair, something being moved. Whoever was inside was not searching fast. They were moving slowly, like they knew exactly where to look. Jake pushed the cellar. Door opened by inches and peered into the darkness of the kitchen. The power was still out, the only light coming from the gray flashes of lightning through the windows. The air felt different now, filled with quiet intent. He waited. The sound came again, closer this time, just beyond the hallway. Max pressed against his leg muscles, trembling. Emily's hand gripped his arm tightly. Jake whispered, barely audible. We moved to the back. Through the yard. Stay low. They slipped out the back door, the rain hitting their faces, cool and relentless. The wind carried the smell of wet grass and earth. Behind them, the faint creak of the floorboards echoed again, louder this time. As they reached the yard, Jake turned for one last look at the house. A single shadow moved across the window, slow and deliberate. It was gone before the lightning struck again. They ran toward the tree line, Max leading the way, his body moving like a ghost through the rain. The storm swallowed the sound of their steps, but the fear stayed with them, deep and unspoken. Whatever had come into the house that night was not the wind, and it was not leaving. The morning after the storm was strangely calm. The air smelled of wet pine and earth, the kind of scent that lingers after long rain. Mist curled low over the ground, drifting between the trees like slow-moving breath. The forest around the stone house felt alive again, yet heavy, as if it had seen too much. The creek murmured softly nearby, swollen from the night's downpour. Jake Walker stood at the back door, coffee in hand, eyes scanning the edge of the woods. The storm had passed, but the unease inside him had not. He had not slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shadow moving across the window. Now in daylight, the memory seemed less real, but not gone. Beside him, Max sat still, first slightly damp eyes locked toward the forest. His tail barely moved, but his ears twitched at every sound. Emily Carter came up behind Jake. Her face was pale from exhaustion, but her gaze was steady. She wore one of Jake's old flannel shirts rolled up at the sleeves, her hair tied back in a rough knot. She looked less like a journalist now, and more like someone trying to survive a secret. "We cannot stay here," she said quietly. "Whoever came last night will come again." Jake nodded slowly. "You are right. But before we go, there is someone I need to find." Emily frowned. "Who?" "An old cop. Name is Albert Mason. He used to work the county before Bradley disappeared. I heard about him years ago when I still wore a uniform. They said he quit after the case broke him. He lives somewhere deep in these woods. If anyone still remembers what happened, it is him." Emily crossed her arms. "And you think he will talk to us?" Jake looked toward Max, who had risen to his feet, nose to the wind. "He will, if he believes we are on the right side." They packed what they needed: flashlights, the folder, a canteen, and a small piece of jerky that Max refused to eat until Jake told him it was safe. Then they followed the narrow trail behind the house, the one that led deeper into the trees. The forest was thick and shadowed sunlight breaking through only in thin threads. Every few steps, Jake glanced behind, instincts still alive from old habits. The ground was soft underfoot, carpeted with needles and moss. Max moved ahead, his nose low tail level. After nearly an hour, they reached a small clearing. At its center stood a cabin made of dark wood, old but strong. Smoke drifted faintly from a narrow chimney. A figure moved near the porch, tall but slightly bent shoulders, broad under a faded green jacket. His hair was silver gray, cut short, and his face was a map of age and memory. Jake called out first, "Morning, sir." The man turned slowly, eyes sharp, even under heavy brows. He looked to be in his late 60s, maybe older, with a trimmed gray beard and skin weathered from decades outdoors. His hands, though rough, were steady. He studied Jake and Emily for a long moment before saying, "You are not from around here." Jake stepped forward. "Name is Jake Walker. This is Emily Carter. We came to talk about Harold Bradley." The old man's eyes darkened, but he did not look surprised. He motioned toward the porch. "Come inside before the woods start listening." The cabin smelled of tobacco, old coffee, and pine sap. The walls were lined with shelves of books, papers, and hunting gear. A radio hummed quietly in the corner, the signal faint. On the table sat a single photograph, 3 men in uniform, one of them unmistakably younger, with the same gray eyes that now watched Jake. Albert Mason poured coffee into chipped mugs. He moved slowly, but with precision, every motion deliberate. He set the mugs down and finally spoke. I figured someone would come asking again. Took you longer than I thought. Jake sat, hands folded. We found something in the old Bradley house. Files, records, a jacket. You were the lead investigator on his disappearance, were not you? Albert nodded once. I was, and I buried more of that case than anyone should have. Emily leaned forward. Why? The old man's jaw tightened. Because truth does not always free people. Sometimes it ruins them. Jake's voice was quiet but firm. Then tell us what ruined him. Albert studied him for a long time before reaching into a drawer beside his chair. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, edges yellowed with age. His hands trembled slightly as he placed it on the table. That, he said, is Bradley's confession. Wrote it the night before he vanished. Jake unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was jagged but strong, the ink smudged in places. It spoke of land stolen under false names of county money, buried in private accounts of a network that reached higher than anyone wanted to admit. And at the bottom one line, written as if in haste, they will come for me tonight. If anyone reads this, trust the man with the badge, not the men with the guns. Jake looked up. Did you try to find him? Albert's gaze dropped to the mug in his hands. I did. Found his car at the edge of the creek 2 days later. No body. The sheriff called it an accident. I called it a message. After that, I resigned. Emily's voice was soft but heavy. You kept this all these years. Albert nodded slowly. Some truths are too dangerous to forget. But you need to understand, boy. If you go any further, you are walking into the same storm that took Bradley. Jake folded the paper and slipped it into his jacket. I have seen worse storms. The old man gave a faint smile, one that did not reach his eyes. You sound like him. He stood and walked to the door. Through the trees, the light had begun to fade, again turning gold against the trunks. He turned back to Jake and Emily, his voice quieter now. Keep the confession safe. Do not trust anyone who offers to help. Secrets like this have owners, and they never let go. Jake nodded once. Thank you, Albert. As they stepped outside, the forest had grown darker shadows stretching long. The air smelled of rain again, faint but near. Max walked beside Jake, ears up, eyes scanning the tree line. That night, back at the house, Jake could not sleep. The paper sat on, the table edges fluttering under the small breath of wind from the cracked window. Emily slept on the couch, exhaustion winning over fear. Jake sat by the window watching the woods. Every rustle of leaves made his pulse quicken. Max lay on the porch, head lifted, eyes open. His ears stayed tuned to the forest, his body still as stone. Somewhere in the darkness, beyond the trees, something moved. But neither man nor dog turned away. The night was theirs to guard. The morning sun rose, gentle and golden over Briar Hollow. The mist that had wrapped the forest for days began to lift, revealing a town that was slowly waking from its long sleep. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of dew and pine, and for the first time in weeks, the light felt warm, rather than watchful. Jake Walker stood on the porch of the stone house, the same place where shadows once lingered. His eyes followed the sunlight as it touched the trees and the roof of the town below. He had not slept much, but the weight in his chest was lighter than it had been in a long time. Inside, the old papers lay spread across the table one last time, evidence of men who thought power could bury the past. Emily Carter sat by the window, typing with steady hands. Her hair was loose this morning, and though she looked weary, Her face carried a quiet strength. There was a new fire in her eyes, not of fear, but of purpose. Days of running, of silence, of watching the dark, all of it had led to this moment. Jake poured 2 cups of coffee and placed one beside her. She looked up briefly, offering a small smile. "You sure about this?" he asked softly. "Once it is out there, you cannot take it back." Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. "That is the point, Jake. If we do not tell it now, it will stay buried forever." She pressed the final key and leaned back. On the screen, the headline glowed bright against the white background. "The Mayor Who Never Died. How a Hidden Network Stole Briar Hollow's Land and Lives." Below it were scanned copies of Bradley's confession, the stolen deeds, and photos linking the supposed accident to men still sitting in office. Emily closed her laptop, her hands trembling slightly. "It is sent," she said quietly. "The story will go live in minutes." Jake nodded, though his stomach tightened. He had seen what truth could do in war and in peace. It freed some people and destroyed others. By noon, the town was buzzing. Phones rang. Doors opened. People who had once turned away from Jake now gathered in front of the diner, the sheriff's office, the small square that had been empty for years. At the edge of the crowd stood Sheriff Nolan Pierce, a man in his 50s with graying hair and a lined face that carried both authority and fatigue. He had been the kind of man who followed orders his whole life, not because he was corrupt, but because it was safer to pretend not to see. Today, his badge caught the sunlight, and for the first time, he looked like a man ready to face what he had ignored. Emily stood beside him as reporters from nearby counties arrived. Her voice was calm but clear, each word cutting through the hum of the crowd. She spoke of land stolen under false names of officials who hid their crimes behind fake deaths, and of a confession that had survived 2 decades in the dark. Jake stayed near the back, watching. Max sat at his side, ears perked eyes, scanning every movement in the crowd. The dog had become something more than a companion to him. Now he was a reminder that even in silence, loyalty had a voice. When the first wave of anger broke through the crowd, Jake felt it like thunder. People shouted names, demanded answers, and for a moment he feared chaos. But then an old farmer stepped forward, thin-stooped, his face carved by years of loss. He lifted his voice steady and raw. "We were never crazy," he said. "They took our land, our homes, our sons. We were never crazy." The words carried through the air like a bell, and suddenly the noise changed. It was no longer rage, but unity. Sheriff Pierce raised his hand for silence. His voice trembled as he spoke. "The case of Harold Bradley is officially reopened. Every document, every witness, every piece of evidence will be examined. The truth will not stay buried this time." Emily's shoulders eased. The crowd began to applaud, not wildly, but with the kind of strength that comes from hope long denied. Jake looked down at Max, who tilted his head as if listening to something far away. He reached down, scratching behind the dog's ear. "We did it, buddy." That night, the stone house no longer felt like a cage of secrets. The papers were gone, delivered to the sheriff's office for safekeeping. The air inside was warm, carrying the scent of coffee and firewood. Emily sat by the fireplace, her notebook open but untouched. Jake leaned against the doorway, watching the light play across the walls. "You ever think we would make it this far?" he asked. Emily smiled faintly. "Honestly, no. But you were right about one thing. Some things are worth fighting for, even when it hurts." He nodded slowly. The sound of crickets filled the spaces between their words. Outside, Max lay on the porch again, head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed, but alert. Every so often, he would lift his head and glance toward the forest, where the last traces of mist still clung to the ground. Jake stepped outside, sitting beside him. The stars were out now, scattered across the sky, like promises finally kept. He looked at the horizon, then at the dog, who had followed him through every shadow. "You brought me back," he murmured. "You brought me home." Max wagged his tail once, slow and content. Jake's gaze drifted to the woods, one last time. The darkness was no longer something to fear. It was simply the place where light had not yet arrived. Inside the house, the clock ticked steady and calm. The world outside had changed, and though scars remained, so did the quiet certainty. The truth, even when buried deep, would always find a way back to the light. And in that silence, man and dog finally rested. The summer sun hung gentle over Briar Hollow. The air was warm but mild, carrying the scent of sawdust, wildflowers, and pine. A soft breeze moved through the valley, touching the leaves and whispering against the stones of the old house. The season had settled kindly, as if the land itself had chosen to breathe again after years of holding its silence. Jake Walker stood outside the house, his hands steady on a newly sanded beam. The stone walls, once cracked, and gray, now glowed faintly golden under the afternoon light. A small sign hung by the front gate, carved carefully into oak. It read, "Briar Hollow Workshop, an archive." The place that had once been filled with shadows and secrets now smelled of life. Inside, the old living room had become a warm space, lined with shelves of files, letters, and maps. Emily Carter sat at a long wooden desk, covered in open folders. Her hair shimmered chestnut under the light from the open window. The wind moved a few loose strands across her cheek, and she brushed them away absently while writing notes in neat, sharp strokes. Emily had changed in quiet ways. Her voice carried more calm now, her shoulders no longer tense from running or watching the door. She wore simple clothes, a linen shirt rolled at the sleeves and jeans faded from work. But her eyes, still sharp and searching, held the steady fire of someone who had walked through fear and found something stronger than it. Jake stepped in, wiping his hands with a rag. The smell of fresh cut wood followed him. He had grown leaner from months of labor. His face tanned, his beard flecked with silver. The lines around his eyes had softened, no longer carved by loss, but by quiet endurance. He leaned against the doorframe and watched Emily as she worked. "You keep everything too neat?" he said, his voice low, but amused. She looked up, smiling faintly. "Someone has to," she replied. "If I let you handle the records, half the town's history would end up smelling like motor oil." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Maybe a little oil is good for it. Keeps the past from rusting." Emily set her pen down and looked at him fully. "You know, Jake, not everyone would rebuild the very place that almost broke them." Jake's eyes moved to the beams above, tracing the sunlight filtering through. "I figured this house had enough ghosts. It deserved something honest for once." Outside, the rhythmic sound of hammering echoed faintly from the back shed. Two local boys, both teenagers, worked there under Jake's quiet guidance. They were tall, eager, and always covered in sawdust. Jake had hired them a month ago when the townspeople started bringing him work, fixing fences, carving signs, repairing furniture that had been left to rot. He paid them fairly, teaching them how to hold a chisel and when to trust their eye over the ruler. It gave the boys something they had not known they needed: patience, craft, and pride. It gave Jake something he had not realized he missed: purpose. By late afternoon, the heat softened into gold. Emily closed her notebook and walked outside. Max lay stretched on the porch, his fur gleaming black and tan, his muzzle touched with white. He was older now, slower to rise, but still held that calm alertness that had once saved their lives. When the children passed by on the road, they always stopped to greet him. Some brought him treats, others whispered small thanks as if he understood. The town had given him a new name, spoken with affection and pride, the Dog of Justice. Jake joined Emily on the porch, sitting beside Max. He handed her a glass of cold tea, the ice clinking softly. The valley spread before them, bathed in the soft light of the setting sun. The river shimmered in the distance, winding through fields now returned to the people who owned them again. Emily leaned back against the railing. "You ever think about leaving here, Jake?" He smiled faintly. "I used to, but not anymore." She studied him for a moment. "You look different, lighter." He glanced at her, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Maybe that is what happens when you stop running from ghosts and start building something instead." They fell quiet for a while, listening to the hum of the summer air. Max shifted his weight, resting his head on Jake's boot. When the light turned soft and long, Jake reached down, brushing his hand along the dog's fur. "We made it old, friend," he said quietly. "You kept me alive long enough to remember how to live again." Max lifted his head slightly, his brown eyes calm and deep. He wagged his tail once, slow and steady. The sound of laughter drifted from the road. The two boys from the workshop were leaving, waving goodnight. Jake raised a hand in return, his eyes warm with pride. They reminded him of himself once young, uncertain, but holding the quiet strength to begin again. Emily stood and walked down the steps to the garden. The flowers they had planted together, lavender marigold and wild daisies, bent gently under the wind. She turned to look back at Jake and Max on the porch. The sunlight framed them both like an old photograph made of peace and memory. Jake leaned back against the railing. The porch creaked softly beneath him. The world around him felt still balanced between day and dusk. He looked at Max again and spoke, his voice almost a whisper. "We are home now, are we not, old boy?" Max's tail flicked once against the floor, and his gaze turned toward the horizon, where the sun melted into gold and the light touched everything with forgiveness. Jake closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. The scent of summer filled his chest, wood grass and life. For the first time in years, he did not feel like a soldier or a survivor. He felt like a man who had come home. And beside him, the loyal dog, who had never left his side, watched the world grow quiet content in the warmth of a summer that asked for nothing more than to be lived. As the golden light of summer lingered on the valley, Briar Hollow began to heal. The people who once carried silence in their hearts now carried purpose. They rebuilt fences, replanted gardens, and reopened shops that had been closed for years. The laughter of children returned to the streets, and the songs of evening birds filled the air where fear once lived. Jake Walker found meaning in every board he carved and every nail he set. His hands, once used for survival, now built things that would last. Emily Carter turned the archive into a place where truth was kept safe and stories were shared freely. She welcomed townsfolk who brought their own memories so that history could belong to everyone again. Max grew slower with time, but his eyes still carried the steady calm of faith. He had been the quiet guardian of this house and the silent bridge between a man and the light that saves him. In his presence, there was a peace that felt sacred, as if the world itself whispered forgiveness through every breath of summer wind. The story of Jake, Emily, and Max spread beyond Briar Hollow. Travelers stopped by to see the house where courage and loyalty had once uncovered the truth. Some came to read the records. Others came simply to stand on the porch and feel hope again. Jake often said to those who asked how he had found strength again, "It was never mine alone. It was given in the moments I listened instead of feared, in the loyalty of a good dog, and in the quiet grace that comes when you believe you are being guided home." And so the stone house stood not as a reminder of pain, but as a promise that light can always return to the darkest places. That love and honesty can heal even what was broken beyond repair. This story is a small miracle, a whisper from above, reminding us that even in hardship, faith can move mountains and hearts. If you believe in second chances, in kindness, and in the silent miracles that guide our days, then share this story. Leave your thoughts below. Join our family of hope and subscribe to walk with us through more stories of loyalty and grace. May the Lord bless you and your loved ones with peace, understanding, and strength. May His light fill your home as it did for Jake and Max, and may every act of love remind you that no matter how far you have wandered, you can always find your way back home.